Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another Explore Explain episode. In today's session, I'm delighted to welcome Doctors Laura Earlberg and Samuel Huron. Samuel, Laura, great to see you. Thank you so much for giving up your time today for this. Let you introduce yourselves to people, to the viewers and to the listeners. Laura, I'll come to you first. Who you are, where you're based, where you're coming to us from today, and a little bit about your role.
Yeah, so my name is Laura Earlberg. I'm an associate professor of computer science at the University of Calgary. I live up in beautiful Canmore, Alberta, which is like tucked in the Canadian Rockies. And yeah, I'm one of the 4 co-authors of Making with Data, which is a book all about the process of creating physical representations with data.
Wonderful. And to you, Samuel?
Yes, hi, I'm Samuel Huron. I'm an associate professor at Telecom Paris, which is part of the Institute of Polytechnique of Paris. And I'm doing research about information visualization, interaction design, and constructive visualization.
Marvelous.
And I'm in Paris.
Paris, Leeds, Calgary. We've got a real split geographically today. So thank you for your time today. And as Laura mentioned, we're talking about a book that you co-authored, edited, curated, did everything for all the heavy lifting, that came out very recently called Making with Data. And we should mention also, in absence, Till Nagel and Wes Willett, who were the other members of the team that worked on this. But I know there's more people beyond that as well, in terms of contributors. So let me come to you first, Laura, just to sort of set the scene. What is this book about? What's the sort of premise?
Yeah, so we all met up at a Dagstuhl seminar, which is sort of this academic meeting of the minds that happens at this crazy castle in Germany. It's predominantly for computer science and mathematics, and it was all around the idea of data physicalization. And so there was sort of a subgroup of us that split off, thinking specifically about how these artifacts come into being. So there was a subset of us that was kind of really interested in this question of, when we are making with data, what does that mean? What does that even look like? And the one thing we could agree on was it looks very different depending on who you are, what your background is, what the data is, what your medium is. And so, yeah, the origins of the book are sort of in that meeting back in 2018.
Yeah.
And then from there, it sort of spun out into the well, what's the best way to tell this story? And from there, it became a much less prescriptive, this is how you should do it, and much more descriptive, let's try to find the people who are engaged in this practice and ask them to describe it for themselves.
Great point. And we'll pick up on the sort of process that you went through there at Dagstuhl. I picked up there that you, that's sort of one thing that you could all agree on, which I think in itself is quite an interesting challenge for any definitions and distinction in this field. But I'll come to you, Samuel. Mm-hmm. The whole notion of sort of data-driven making and physicalization, it's not new, as we'll discuss very shortly. It's been going for tens of thousands of years, if you sort of stretch the definitions. But just again, in a nutshell, and for people listening or watching who are perhaps new to this notion of physicalization, I mean, what is that? Where's the boundary between data visualization and physicalization?
Good question.
In a nutshell.
I guess the boundary is fact that data in a visualization are only represented on 2D. So that could be on a screen or on paper. But when you are representing data physically, you are using more dimension and more and a zillion other way to encode the data. And that's, I think that's the difference. And what is also particularly interesting is we are rediscovering data physicalization now, but as you mentioned, this was something that was here, like before we even know to write a human language. So that's I think one of the interesting things about data physicalization. It's about how humans are able to represent data in their own space and in their own way.
And I think what's kind of interesting, perhaps, when I first looked at the book, is that my own perception of what I saw as physicalization was really quite narrow. I wasn't thinking about. I was thinking about this really as a contrast to digital visualization, and this was just static and tactile. But it truly is a broad array of all the senses, not just the visual, and all different media, all different formats, and it kind of instantly sort of blew my mind in terms of, right, I've learned something already after about page 5 in this book. But again, this moment in time that we're at now, with there's lots of discourse about things like AI and about digital, and perhaps 5-10 years ago we were talking about the tension between desktop and mobile, and it feels a real kind of, it feels to a certain degree a quite nostalgic look at visualization, given that it's not purely on screen, it's not based on devices. And again, just coming back to you on this one, Samuel, do you think there's something where we need to almost just occasionally sort of just stop and look back at what's been done before, and not just race towards this inevitable horizon of digital?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think in a way, digital have some really, really strong superpower. They can allow you to modify everything. Maybe you have some algorithms that modify things for you, etc., etc. And I think they are providing a lot of benefits to a lot of organizations every day, everywhere. But there is also some drawback. And most of the time when we are designing something, sometimes we are only focused on the things that we know or the type of solutions that we are producing. And maybe creating physicalization in certain contexts and certain cases could be even more effective than creating a visualization. And that's always difficult to know when and where. But this is one response. A second response that I find might be interesting also, it's in the field of human-computer interaction, there is some people that have tried for decades and decades to bridge the benefits of the physical world with the benefits of the digital world. And it's still a field of research where people are trying to find some bridge and creating some new devices for providing some artifacts that will provide the benefit of both worlds.
Perfect. So I'll come to you on this one, Laura. So obviously as I mentioned there, we can look at the definition of the sort of lineage of physicalizations going back thousands and thousands of years. But one thing that's kind of made clear quite early in the book is that this is a contemporary look at where things are in terms of methods and techniques now. And it's a showcase, as you said, you've kind of created a space for the makers of these works to sort of tell the story themselves. Was that contemporary sort of filter and or caveat an important motive for the 4 of you working on this book, or was it just an inevitable thing? We need to find a way to cope with the amount of content we could include, so let's just say, right, it has to be contemporary.
I think for us there was a certain pragmatism to it, because while we have sort of evidence and historical record of data physicalization going back centuries and thousands of years, we don't have access to the people who made them. So we have the artifacts, but sometimes we don't even have the data. And we definitely do not necessarily have the process or the rationale behind it. So a lot of it came down to who could we find to tell the story, and grounding that story in one piece. Many of the people we talk to, this is their practice. It's not just, I made this one piece and I'm going off to my next thing. This is actually something that they've thought very deeply about. And in each chapter we talk about kind of the motivations, and it sort of flows a little bit, where someone will start talking about the piece before, and then they'll start talking about the piece afterward, and how the particular chapter, the particular artifact is situated in the broader arc of their work. So for us, it was partially pragmatic, and also I think for us it's reassuring to think of it as a snapshot. because this book will live on beyond its publication date. And there are still people who are making data visualizations right now, and we can't include them in the book because the book has been published. So the way I like to think of it as not necessarily contemporary as in this ongoing thing, but very much so a snapshot of when we were working on the book, who we could find who would be willing to share their stories.
Right. And I guess by giving people the chance to talk about their projects as case studies, that in itself is built upon the techniques that have been established for thousands of years. So they'll talk to and speak to that sense of, they've not just made this up themselves, they've learned from what's gone before.
Oh yeah.
And again, back to yourself, Samuel, for this, what I mentioned there about my own perhaps narrow view of what this world is and entails, was that also a motivating factor to try to illuminate the full spectrum of what people are kind of creating these days, or did that just happen, almost by chance, because there's so much stuff anyway that it's not even something you have to attempt to do, it just happens?
Well, I think that was during the Dagstuhl seminar we had this moment where Laura, Wes, Till, myself, and Denton, another person, was there, and we were trying to understand the questions that Laura mentioned, how people are making with data. And one of the things that I came to this seminar with like a packet of cards like that are just which is a physicalization of Pierre and Yvonne data sets. And we tried to identify what was the common elements in terms of process where all people are making with data. And that's where it starts to be like, how to say, really open, wide, and creating a lot of different opportunity. And I don't know, but in a way it was also part of the intention, try to look beyond domain barriers. One of the things which is interesting with visualization and physicalization is there is many different communities that are interested by this phenomenon, and sometimes they are speaking to each other and sometimes not. And we wanted to go across this community. We wanted really to. I don't know if it's replied to your question, but
well, it is, because I mean the thing is, and it kind of leads on to my next question. You've touched on there that there's, as we'll get onto shortly, some of the methods that are being used are things like handcrafts. These are techniques that have existed in perhaps an artistic community for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it's almost like data visualization as a field is sort of kind of borrowing and sort of peering beyond the curtain of those worlds. But where I was going to go with my next question, and it picks up on a wonderful line in the foreword from Barbara Tversky, mentioning that making data physical creates art, incidentally or intentionally. And as we know in the data viz world, there's always been this slight kind of corridor of tension, perhaps, between when does data viz become art as a motivation, as a consequence. The purists who hate the notion that anything can be anything other than information as a method to communicate. And I guess, once again, with the physicalization stuff, even perhaps more so than the classic visualization world, you can start to tiptoe into the world of art. Was that something, I'll come to you on this, Laura, was that something that you were, again, looking to embrace and really try and widen the spectrum? Or were you mindful that there still had to be fundamental to these pieces some notion of communication, obviously data driven underneath it, but still the artifact that emerges had to communicate in some form?
I think we did have, we're all kind of viz researchers at the end of the day, so we do have this notion of communication as a goal in our core. That said, art communicates just at a very different level. So there's several of the pieces in the handcraft section, like Mika West Anthropocene Footprints comes to mind, Laura Manson's Happy Endings comes to mind, where being able to read, it's not about reading data points.
Sure.
It's not about, there's a little booklet that goes with it if you care about it. But in many ways, it's trying to almost like figure out ways to communicate the gestalt of the data in the case of Anthropocene Footprints, because the data is there in the materials that were used to build these sculptures.
Right.
but again, you're not going to read it. You're going to get a sense of the data,
Yeah.
a sense of the trend overall, but not necessarily, this is the specific emissions data that I'm reading from this particular possible future. So I'd argue they all communicate data, but on different levels and with different goals in mind.
Right. And I think that's true in certainly to me it feels true in contemporary visualization, whereby some things can be read, some things can be felt, some things are told, some things are acquired, or just in the way that we can respond to different artworks, we can draw our own interpretation. Sometimes you want to open that thing, and clearly across the book's contents there are case studies where some of those things are more explicit as communication devices, and some are more to be experienced individually. So I think it's a beautiful balance, whether it was an intentional sort of mixture in your kind of inclusion criteria, but it certainly materialized that way.
Yeah, and I was going to just
Jump in.
add real quick,
Yeah.
where you encounter these pieces, because they are physical, they inhabit space just like you or I do.
Yeah.
And so some of these like the Anthropocene footprints and endings, you sort of encounter in a gallery space where your mindset is, I am an art goer, I'm here to experience art. Oh, there's data behind this art, and that's the beginning of your series of questions. If we think about some of the more participatory approaches, like Seaboat, for example, you are in the space that is currently being queried, and you're an active participant in it. And as that changes the relationship and what exactly is being communicated. And in some
that sort of situatedness is obviously very important.
Yeah, and other pieces are, like, especially in automation, are sort of these visualization platforms almost that are being shown predominantly in research communities for the time being. And even that, again, sort of changes the purpose of the visualization in some ways. You are communicating data, but in other ways, you're communicating the potential of this platform to go even further. So what it's communicating also very much so depends on who made it, but also where it's being shown to people in our physical reality that we live in.
Of course, yeah. And again, in the introduction to the book, you make it clear that this has been crafted as a book, and I think that's a nice choice of words to showcase the work. And again, different books have different purposes. Some are there to be a coffee table piece to inspire kind of creatively. Others are to be informative. And I think this bridges both, because each case study has a story behind it and a process. It breaks it down to the tools that have been used, which we'll come on to very shortly. But to you, Samuel, I mean, who's the target reader for this? I mean, I know that's a horrible question to ask. We have to ask it because it's this world that we're in. But when you were as a group sticky noting in Miro, probably the ideas that you had. I mean, what was the sort of characteristic of the sort of person that you want this to work most for as an audience or a readership?
I think we wrote something inside the book proposal that's probably not what I will reply, but I think people that are data enthusiasts or people that want to create things, and again across communities. So we have ourselves, Till, Wes, Laura, and I, diverse backgrounds. Some of us have done some work in design and now are doing like research in HEI or visualization or other domain. And one of the things that we really wanted to have in mind is have some people that are probably not only academics, so it could be used for academics.
Yeah.
People that want to discover this topic and people that would like to create things with data. So then when you say that, and you can ask, okay, but what is your marketing target? Well, it's kind of unclear. It could fall down to a lot of type of people, right? If you are a student and you are doing you are studying product design and you want to embed some approach with data, you can read this book. If you are a student or if you are a designer or even like a professional designer, senior designer, and you are doing digital stuff all the time and you want to transform it into physical stuff, I think it's a book for you too. But if you are an academic and you are interested by physicalization, that's also so that was kind of a difficulty to try to adapt to all of these targets in the same time. So I don't know if I'm.
Well,
I hope.
Well, let me just pick up on that, because I think a key point about this that I really kind of felt as a reader of the book is that whereas some books like this could, again, go back to the notion of coffee table books, it could sit there and you might think, wow, this is amazing stuff, but I could never do that. This is well beyond my reach. This is beyond my ceiling. What I loved about it, especially when it comes down to the dissection of the creative process, is that you were sort of lowering the ladder to kind of bring anybody up. You know, we've all got data, we've all got materials around the room, we've all got different things, crafts, whether it's nature we can use. And so, you know, I'll come to you on this, Laura. You know, that was obviously a clear outcome of the book. Once again, was it something that you felt was important to sort of set the tone of the contents and the positioning of the writing, in a sense?
Yeah, it's in a lot of times the writing is very much so the voices of the people invited to contribute the chapters. But when we were asking people to contribute chapters, we wanted to get a breadth of expertise and types of expertise. So for example, a Rimini Protocol is a theater production group in Germany that did 100% city. That is a very, very particular type of expertise I definitely do not have, but their ability to put on a full-blown theater production that is leveraging data and, you know, casting the actors, working with these everyday people, is very specialized expertise that you would look at that and say, that is super inspiring. I might be able to translate that into, you know, how I think about digital engagement with my audience,
Right.
but it's a very different medium. Or Adrienne Siegel's furniture building, the Snow-Water Equivalent Cabinet is building on her very deep expertise as a furniture builder. And so there's certain corners of this space that feel inaccessible in some ways, but it's really interesting to sort of break down their process and still see there's like the same kinds of questions and issues are coming up, but the way they're expressing them is through the lens of their expertise. And then you flip back to things like V-pleat origami from Sarah Hayes, which is her entire goal was to think about materials that are readily accessible and ways to play with data physically that are as immediate as possible.
Right.
And also some of the participatory methods are, again, thinking about how do you open invitation to anybody and everybody to think about this. So whether or not, even though often it's someone with a professional eye who's inviting people more broadly to participate in visualization, it does mean that you could also ask yourself, I could invite myself to participate in data.
Right.
If I just have, you know, some tiles here and there, or sort of like some Legos that I can play with, or I have this hobby that I do on the side, maybe I can use that to also think about how I might bring data and use that as my lens into data physicalization.
That's right. And I think the other thing that struck me is that although these are 24, I think it is, case studies as, you know, standalone pieces of work and processes, I also felt it was like a big menu of things I could sort of dip into a little bit of that and then take a little bit from there and almost sort of amalgamate the techniques into different ways. I've not yet done it, but, you know, in terms of the way it made me feel as a reader, I think that certainly came across. Now, just sort of taking a step outside the book and back to this kind of origin story of Dagstuhl. So I had the great fortune to be part of last year's 2022 Dagstuhl, albeit remotely, due to passport administration issues. But I know a little bit about the mechanics of how this seminar runs. It's a very unique event. Samuel, just for the listeners and viewers again, could you just illuminate people to just give us a sense of what is Dagstuhl? And in this case, this is 2018, I think you mentioned, kind of what was the sort of the process that you roughly went through in the week to start to get the wheels turning for what we now see as a book?
So Dagstuhl is, I think it's this amazing castle in Germany where computer scientists are invited to organize retreats on a cutting-edge topic, and when they're organizing this retreat, we have to have people from all over the world, every level of seniority, and also not only it's possible also to invite not only academics and having other person involved. It could be between 30 to 60 people. I think this one was the data physicalization one. I don't remember, but it was huge. There is a lot of person. Usually during the week, every invitee are on site, and we are working during all the day, and during the evening there is like more social events. So for the data physicalization one, and I think it was like almost similar to most of the Dagstuhl that I've been. The first day, everybody is presenting themselves. Then we are trying to identify some emerging thematics in which where we can form group and where people can work in smaller group. Then we have this breakout group, and everybody are reporting during I think almost 2 days. And on this group, we try to produce different things or have idea of outcome and piece of new knowledge that can be built on the thematic. And I think it's inside one of these groups that we start toying with this idea of making the book. I clearly remember at one point having Till and Laura somewhere in the room, and they were presenting, "Oh, we are interested by making," and I was, yeah. And after that, during I think the third day is starting to speak about like potential outcome, potential output, and fourth day is like trying to figure out what will be done in the future. We discuss to make it as a book during this third or fourth day.
Right.
During the event, one of the things that we did is we started to interview some of the people on site to test our idea. To test the idea of like trying to gather how to say that, elicitate the process of making with data,
Right.
elicitate the type of tools that people are using, and trying to understand the reflection that people can have. And I think during this workshop, we already, like before the interview, we already start to create kind of a questionnaire or an interview guide. It was not really clear, but that was the first version. And we ran it with this. I think it was with Adrienne and
Laura Perovic.
and then Laura Perovic, and maybe a third one now. I don't remember. Yeah, I think Adrienne and Laura, and Volkner, data field gravity also, I think, and that was I think that was the way we start, and after we refined this questionnaire over time, and I don't know if it's replied to your question.
Well, it does, and one of the things, again, from my experience with Dagstuhl, is that it feels quite unconferencey in that you're allowed to let things flow, you're allowed to let the ideas form, and you sort of flow with where the wind is going in the event. And there are different strands. There's something that you're working on, and then there's other groups working on other things. To you on this one, Laura, I mean, what was the almost initial question that you as a spin-off group were looking to answer? Was it around developing a taxonomy for physicalizations? Was it about trying to understand creative and creation processes? Or was it just something that was quite free-form and you were just waiting to find patterns and taxonomies that might emerge through discussions?
Yeah, I think when we sort of started out as our group at Dagstuhl, because it was a slightly larger group, we were all interested in process for various reasons with various motivations. So my background is as a design researcher, so thinking very explicitly about how does creative process work. My background's more in engineering design and product design, so
Right.
I come at it a little bit with that lens. So thinking about how it works, but also people were interested in process because they use physicalization for teaching, and they're trying to figure out, how do I explain how this process works to my students?
Right.
And I mean, we had sort of this common theme of interest in process. But then when it comes down to how to explore that topic, a lot of us are from a slightly more we swing qualitative, and we also swing less at the like deterministic, like
Right.
this is the way it is, but much more recognizing the sort of like glittering diversity of perspectives among us, because we had people who were at Dagstuhl who were practitioners who you can say everything you want in an academic paper, but that does not describe what actually happens with the client.
Right.
And we had people who are artists who are like, you can say whatever you want as someone who comes at it from a more computer science way of knowing, but that does not describe their exploratory process, which is part of how we sort of picked our initial people that we interviewed, was explicitly trying to, among at least the Dagstuhl attendees,
Yeah.
head towards the people who represented a more artistic way of knowing, a more research way of knowing, a more practitioner way of knowing, to see if there are any common threads of a story that we could use to sort of establish a common structure, with full expectation that they're going to interpret as they will and let the story kind of follow as it will.
So sort of stress test it in a sense with the extremes. Yeah, jump in, Samuel.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think one of the concepts that help us create this category and this thematic among the diversity was this idea of data rendering, which is part of Ivan Jensen and Piotr Grisevich a pipeline to describe how people are making data physicalization. And the data rendering is this idea that at one point you have data somewhere, and at another point you transform it into something that people can perceive. And I think this is a way we kind of craft more or less this different team, like handcraft, participation, digital production, actuation, and environments. It was, okay, we have all of these different projects, but how they render the data at one point, right? And yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned at the start, Laura, that something along the lines of there was one thing that we could all agree on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, before we get back into the book itself, what was your reflection looking back at that Dagstuhl event about maybe the things that you were challenged on in terms of your sort of prior understanding or perceptions, the things that were widened or narrowed or challenged or confirmed? What, was it just you've already alluded to this, it wasn't perhaps a straight line, yes, everything I knew is the same as it is now, but what were kind of some of the key things that you kind of left feeling, oh, that's a different take than I had before?
I think for us, we anticipated uncertainty and surprise. Like we were expecting to find radically different stories, and we were unsurprised that we were surprised, if that makes sense.
Right.
Because we were expecting for that diversity. I think the thing that was most challenging for us is trying to balance and juggle all that diversity and stay sort of future thinking and relevant to, like, okay, what is at the edges of data physicalization today, which is part of how we ran into the environment chapter, was we've, like, Dietmar Offenhuber was at the Dagstuhl, and he was definitely coming in with a very different approach and way of looking at the natural world than the rest of us did. And one of the exercises we did was walking out into the woods outside of Dagstuhl and making data in the woods. And so for us, I think the biggest challenge was making sure that we were trying to do our best due diligence to capture as much diversity as we could, which is terrifyingly challenging when you only have so many chapters you can include. And so I think that was sort of our biggest challenge, was pushing ourselves that way. So continuing to dig, continuing to press to say, like, okay, but who else is doing something adjacent to this? Where else can we find examples?
Yeah, and I think there's something, and it's perhaps the theme that you mentioned there, Samuel, about sort of rendering data. It feels to me like there's a point that we're now at. This is anecdotal. Let me just say that before I'm trying to cast off some sort of scientific observation. I just feel at the moment, with so many different creative techniques developing momentum across visualization and beyond, that there's almost a move away from visualization as the most useful term, and maybe something like representation being in its place, because we've got sonification, we've got physicalization, we've got things that are print, things that are digital, and it feels like there's a shifting of the nomenclature, of the labeling that's now taking place, which is terrible for me because I've anchored everything to the word visualization in all my life. But do you feel, Samuel, that that's perhaps a takeaway for you, maybe, that we are, obviously this is physicalization, but do you feel that visualization perhaps is less relevant than it would have been 5-10 years ago, more representation, rendering, as you mentioned?
Well, I think I will not say that it's not less relevant. I think I think I think there is a reason why we are sharing data visually and through data visualization. Probably the first reason is the vision is the sense that we have with the biggest bandwidth.
Yeah.
And also sharing image for some reason and sharing visual is really, really easy in our world. And we have organized our world with a lot of facility to share image. Just look at a computer. You have a CPU and you have a GPU, but you don't have a physical rendering unit.
Right.
But
Not yet.
Not yet. Maybe in the future. But I think what I find interesting is, and I really love visualization, and I think I will still work a lot in visualization. It's just, to me, thinking about the other way we are representing data with physical object, with participation, or with environmental procedure. Always it's helped me to challenge the definitions that I already have and to think about new ideas also for visualization. And that's one of the things that one of the reason or one of the motivation why I love that. Still, I think in a way we might see more and more physical representation around us. I think some of this representation could be really useful in a lot of context and in a lot of cases. So.
Right.
I think they are not in competition.
Yes. Yeah, they're all in the
It's
same
just
circle packing diagram, shall we say?
yeah.
Any thoughts on that yourself, Laura?
Yeah, it's like as someone who, like I mentioned, I come from sort of a design research background, and I'm sort of meandering into visualization. I find it interesting to think about how some of the backbone, I mean, data visualization as a field of study is so much more developed than
Sure.
like physicalization or like the notion of data in fabrication communities. And the type of conversation that visualization designers have, the type of like super nuanced, detailed, thoughtful conversations around data that they have, trust me, do not necessarily happen in fabrication communities.
Right.
And they're just sort of now trying to wrap their head around what does it mean to have something that is data driven, that I'm digitally fabricating, or wait a minute, I could use a parametric design approach. I mean, they have other types of language, and that translation is starting to happen.
Right.
I feel like all of the groundwork from the visualization community is still critical to understanding kind of new mediums for representing data. Because I mean, I know with Sam, I've talked multiple times about like what are the Bertin equivalent, visual variables for physical variables, and that just breaks everyone's brains every single time.
Right.
But because we have Bertin to look at for inspiration, to say like, well, visualization has at least figured out a backbone. It's still evolving, but like there is a backbone to sort of think about and reference. That's been extremely valuable. So I still feel like visualization is relevant. And again, it's that matter of expertise in your medium, so to speak. And so you might not be a furniture designer or a professional theater production company, but if you are a trained graphic designer, then visualization is going to be your happy home by all means, and where you know how to flex the most. So I don't think everyone has to become a data representation person.
Right.
But I think like recognizing that we have this umbrella that we all kind of share, and starting to sort of reach out and see if we can find common ground, common language to work within.
No, that's really insightful, and I think it leads us nicely onto the book structure, because the primary kind of architecture is 5 sort of chapters or themes. And again, I think one of the byproducts that I'm now realizing of this is that, as you said, these communities can see other non-visualization communities and learn from each other, and not just us from them. But the 5 broad themes that we've got are handcraft, participation, digital production, actuation, and environment. Now, these are going to be very broad questions in terms of process for the book, but how did you land on these 5 as the sort of thematic ways to organize the content? So I'll start off for yourself, Laura. I mean, what came first? I guess there's a chicken and egg question here, because we've got 24 case studies and we've got 5 themes. Did the case studies emerge from the themes, or did the case studies lead to the themes?
I think we started thinking back on how it came about, coming back to what Sam said earlier. We got this sense of where we have apples and oranges. We have all of these different approaches that kind of fit but don't really fit. They're different rendering approaches. We also we call them themes because they're not mutually exclusive. If we started getting into mutually exclusive categories, we would have no themes at all. Many of the participation approaches feel like handcraft, sort of. Or wait, is that an actuation platform? Or are you using digital production to create, things that actually are able to capture environmental rendering? So it's rough, it's squinty themes, by all means. And I think for us, it was a matter of trying to figure out a set of themes. And I think we figured this out fairly early while at Dagstuhl, even a set of themes that would capture the breadth of approaches that people have used, are using. Handcraft is sort of the one that, we can think about handcraft from thousands of years ago, but wanted to emphasize that people are still handcrafting data representations. And then environment is the one that's sort of the most, I'd say, actuation environment feel the most emergent in some ways, where when we think about a physical data representation, we might not think about robots, or we might not think about traces left by the environment.
Right.
And so it emerged fairly early on. And for us, organizationally, it helped us think through how we would divide and conquer our own tasks as the 4 respective authors, but also how we would think through recruiting to make sure that we would have some level of diversity within and across these themes. So if there was someone who could fit in either one, trying to decide okay, do we need to hear that voice in actuation, or do we need to hear that voice in digital production, and figure out where those needed to sort of fall at the end of the day.
Excellent. I mean, to you on this one, Samuel, I mean, there's 24 case studies in these 5 themes, and there's a part of me that's desperate for number 25 in environment. I mean, was that a thing? Were you searching everywhere for that elusive 5th part of that 5th chapter?
So, yeah, we searched for it. Actually, one of the things that you don't see is all the projects that we tried to invite but could not make it. And I think for the environmental, we had the same issue. It was scratching a little bit, and I think we almost contact 8 other project author, something like that. And either we didn't get a reply on time, or the project was not working well, etc., etc. But one of the things that we tried to do also, it was play against the category sometime, try to find some projects that will not fall inside this category. I'm pretty sure there is other category. Well, I'm not pretty sure. I don't know. I would like to know if there is other categories that we didn't identify. I think that would be amazing to find that. And I have a certain percentage of confidence that it might exist, but but yes, we would have loved to have a 5th one for the environment.
But I think a broader question, I'll stick with you for this, Samuel. A broader question then is, and we'll get onto the kind of case studies themselves shortly, but as we said, this is a contemporary perspective as it was then, not necessarily sort of forevermore, but what were some of the reasons that maybe projects weren't included? Was it just that you couldn't find a certain balance, that you might have had too many craft-based ones and so you had to eliminate some? Was it ever a permissions thing? Was that any sort of frustration / tension?
I think we had multiple criteria. So the first one was clearly to get a sense of balance between every chapter, because there is clearly some really, really cool projects in other sections that we couldn't include. The second point was to have something which was kind of ready for publication and well documented. As you saw in the book, we tried to get some clips and visual element of the process, like sketches or intermediate prototypes, things like that. And another point was also we tried to reach to some people that didn't reply in time, so it was not really it was not really but yeah, I think what was the other elements that were really important for us? To have a lot of visual content. That was really important.
Well, and just to jump in,
Laurie, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to jump in real quick, I think part of that is also because at Artists and Practitioners, we get so used to having the glamour shots of the final thing, but we don't necessarily have glamour shots of process.
Sure.
And so for us, we had people who had fantastic artifacts, good stories behind them, but then when it came to the making sure that they had a visual story to tell about how they arrived there, that was the challenge. It was tricky to figure out, okay, how many images can I muster that show everything from like the conception all the way through to like the final messy implementation. Not everyone has the images and ready for publication images of those pieces of the process.
And I guess for some of those, the structure of the book, which has an introduction from a preeminent creator or academic in each of the 5 themes, I suppose that gives you a backup home to showcase some of these, one photograph only projects, and that's a nice place, obviously, for you to sort of sweep up other examples that don't quite make it to the heft of an individual case study, which is another feature of the book which I really liked, the sort of extra showcasing that gave. Now, onto the kind of case studies themselves. So as we've said, each one is a creative process that includes an intro, the sort of general motivation, the practices and processes, the methods and tools and reflections. And again, you spoke about the Dagstuhl discussions and journey. This felt like it's something that you maybe didn't have initially as a structure, but emerged. Is that fair enough? I'll come to you on this, Laura. Is that something that kind of emerged from the conversations, that these are the 5 headings that sort of best fit this stress test of different types of people? This is where we can at least find a home for the content for each person type.
Yeah, what happened was we had very long meandering conversations for our interviews when we were sort of, test driving this idea. So I think some of the interviews were like almost up to 2 hours asking about, people's process in detail, not exactly knowing what to expect or how to guide that interview. Like across the 3 that we did at Dagstuhl, like we get slightly better each time, but they were way too long. But what we started to do is look at those initial 3 interviews and ask, like, okay, what are not necessarily looking at what's in the interviews, but what on a meta level are they talking about here broadly, to start to figure out, okay, what's the, if we were to butcher this interview and reorganize it, what are the themes that we would reorganize it such that it still feels like a cohesive story, even if at the very end they start talking about the client, or at the very beginning they just start talking about, oh, here's what the final assembly looked like, or final installation looked like. And so we started from these very meandering interviews to start to develop the structure. I think we tested that structure a couple times with, again, Dagstuhl attendees who were very forgiving. They knew kind of what we were working on and were more forgiving to being the guinea pigs testing out our protocol. And from there, we started to refine, okay, here's the order in which to ask people to explain and explore these things. Here's the instructions we need to give on exactly like what are the types of points we wanted to look at. And we also had sort of examples based on those rearranged interviews that we'd done earlier, to give people a hint of like, this is kind of what we mean by motivation, or this is kind of what we mean by a reflection. I think that really helped people understand what we were looking for in the chapters, even though at the
Yeah.
end of the day it was their own words.
And I think something you touched on already is the use of language, that we all describe things differently, even if we might mean the same thing. I mean, to you on this, Samuel, to what extent, looking at the results of what came back to you from the authors around these structures, to what extent did you then face a challenge of having to either, well, both, sorry, preserve the voice of the author and the sort of texture of what they're trying to explain, but simultaneously create a cohesive book of diverse case studies, so that the language, the tone of voice, at least has some commonality without sort of overly smoothing it? I mean, I don't suspect that's an easy answer, more perhaps a fingertip judgment in each case. But how much work, I guess, went into that sort of challenge?
I think that's happened over like multiple paths. So the first thing is, when we discovered the result of this interview, it was super fascinating, and it was really difficult to find the right structure. I think we have been through multiple versions of this structure, and when we got the structure, Laura mentioned we did this kind of example, like a prototype of a chapter. I think it was with Adrian, actually, and during this, when we ask to the other chapter author to give their information or to write the chapter, sometimes we give that as an example. So actually, I think it's already play a first game of filtering or understanding the intention. For some author, we just send this questionnaire, the questionnaire that we produce after Dagstuhl, and they fill it. And then we come back to them, modify it, and like do some correction and editing, and through this path. For other author, we redid some interview. And Laura, she has a really special skill. She can like write as fast as we are speaking. So basically, based on that, I think she said we butcher, but that was really the case. So we tried to cut to fit it to the template again, and then we have been through a path of editing again and again. And I think after that there is another path, which was like proofreading. We have been through 2 proofreading process or 3 proofreading process. So I see it really like as a sedimentation process with like multiple layers.
I mean, I guess that will always be the case with most writing, but it's something that you've got an extra pressure in this case, because you are trying to be faithful to other people's contributions rather than your own writing. But one of the things that I liked that you mentioned, jump in, Laura. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the other sort of editorial challenge I think we probably had more issues with academics who professionally write than with, artists and practitioners who don't have to write narratives. It's like they actually were very lucid about their process. It's the academics, man. Because
that's the episode tagline.
it's the academics, man. Because all of us have academic credentials. You're being approached to write a book chapter, and your first notion is, I am writing a chapter of a book, and the type of language and level of language started to get very jargony and not as descriptive in some ways, because the urge is to think at that meta level, and we have places to do that in the chapters. Sure. But we had to, in many cases, try to give more coaching to the academics to back off, to say, like, it's okay, you can just tell us how it went, and it does not have to be the same level of language, because we wanted to make sure the book was accessible. I mean, for us, it was less about making sure that everyone's voice was sort of consistent across the book. The structure helps with that a lot, but it was much more making sure that we didn't have a jarring shift into,
of course,
strange academic language all of a sudden popping up after I've heard a very personal story about, this is how my project went, and then all of a sudden you have someone who's used to writing academic conference and journal papers, where you have your formal description of methods that doesn't quite make sense given the type of book we were trying to aim for.
Sure, and I suspect that one place where that manifests is where you acknowledge that these creative processes are not linear in real life. They're messy, they're imperfect. There's wastage. There's things you've done wrong. Go back, and I suspect that the artists, the creators in your kind of cohort were perhaps more comfortable with that idea than the academics. But you also mentioned that we have to force this into a linear process because that's how a book works. But we can also embrace the messiness and the uncertainty. Samuel, jump in.
Yeah, no, it was again on the vocabulary because one of the things I remember we had this discussion because we wanted to have the book accessible for non-academic. One of the things we really clearly have done was suppressing the jargon. But suppressing this jargon, we had this issue. It's like everybody was using a different word: data visualization, data physicalization, or indexical representation. So we put this page inside the introduction where we try to collect some of this definition and like make a visualization of them, kind of.
And I guess
but
that
that was
also
a
works
way.
as a way to sort of say, here's where your world fits in, and then your world is a bit more sort of round the bend, and it helps everyone to have that sort of. It's not a classic or formal glossary, but it does help to say, right, we're all in the same book here. I mean, you touched on this before, Laura, with respect to kind of photography and imagery. I mean, that is a crucial aspect of any book, not least this. But the challenges to me, and I guess it's not something that you had to worry about as such because it's the creators, they have to sort of document their own work. But as you've already alluded to, we've got such a variety of scale. We've got some things that are micro, some things that are vast. I mean, just in the very sort of headline sense, can you sort of talk me through some of the challenges or hurdles that you had to get through in terms of curating the imagery for the book and the kind of quality, fidelity that had to kind of entail?
Yeah, we had to make sure that the images themselves were kind of appropriate and ready for print, which comes down to sort of I mean, on a very technical level, like the raw image quality, the DPI, the size of the image, how big can it be? We had to make sure that for each, because of the graphic designer we were working with and the visual layout we were aiming for, we had to make sure that we had at least one very good large image that we could work with as sort of the iconic image for that piece before we get into the process details, which could be a little more different. Sam, oh man, it would be so cool to make a visualization of the scale of all of these relative pieces, because you're totally right. Some of them are like, teeny little robots or little desktop things. And then we've got, architectural scale pieces that are like inside of a giant, airport atrium kind of thing. And to wrap your head around these different scales does take a bit of work. The thing that I'm kind of looking forward to is we do have, in many cases, supplementary materials from people that are interactive.
Right.
For a lot of these pieces, you don't get quite, an image helps, but it doesn't quite give you a sense of the form, the interaction, the scale until you see it in motion in some ways.
Sure.
It's that until you kind of see a tracking shot to understand, oh, right, this is how this all fits together.
Yeah.
Or especially with some of the automation chapters sorts of things and participation, where you see the evolution of the piece over time. It's not the starting state. You actually want to see how people engage with it, because that actually shows you way more about how it behaves, how it works, why it's successful as a physicalization. And so we do have access and permission from some authors to share those materials. And in many cases, we're trying to sort of redirect people towards the artists and creators websites, because they often have posts that articulate them a little bit better, because that interaction and that liveness does matter a lot for some of these pieces.
That's right, and some things you need to be able to watch a video because it's something that's moving, something that's interactive, something that's experienced over a long period of time that you can't possibly recreate in a book. So yeah, the idea that this book is almost a catalogue to then go to digital repositories, resources to read more is a vital aspect of any contemporary book, frankly. But I guess the most immediate thing that we see in the book is the cover design. This sort of, well, I'm going to guess, but you can illuminate me on the actual mechanics of this. But it's a sort of a density plot looking at the kind of the word content of the write-ups across the 5 sections. Is that on the right line so far?
Yes, we had a big, long argument discussion over what should we do for the cover, because we had to
Here we
pick
go.
what we were trying to pick projects and we couldn't pick projects. So we decided we'll just make a data physicalization of the book, and then that can be the cover.
Right.
Which was really funny for us because we did this towards the end of the process. It's like we knew exactly what process looks like for all of this, and so we were taking notes of like, oh, like we documented the whole process because we knew our own structure. And yeah, it was really funny for the 4 of us to then turn around and start co-designing a physicalization together for the cover of the book. And the Easter egg that I find the most satisfying is if you have the soft cover edition, you can actually flex the cover itself and see the title page. The title page has the legend. And you can have that actually line up. So it's, again, this very subtle booky physical interaction you get to have to decode what's going on the cover.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the front cover is such an important thing to get right, and I think you've nailed that. And it's nice that it's based on the data in the book, and it's physical. It's a perfect alignment. I mean, just to sort of wrap up a few things. I mean, looking forward now, you've talked already about this was a moment in time view of the field. Samuel, is there a sequel to this? Is there a second version ever likely to land on the bookshelves?
A second version of Making with Data?
Yeah.
Why not? Well, that was I think it was an incredible journey. I think we have worked on it for 4 years. I don't know if we're gonna have a second version with 25 other artists. I didn't thought about that before. No. Well, why not? I think we discussed many times about making an exhibit, physical manifestation of that. But again, I don't know if it's require also time, but that would be amazing, because like experiencing physically some of the subject or other object would be something really interesting to do.
Absolutely. And Laura, just in terms of where physicalization is in the book, you sort of wrap up in the conclusion where's it heading next? You talk about things like fabrication developments, robotics, obviously AR, VR. We had last week the announcement of Apple's new Vision Pro device. I mean, it feels like there's only growth, expansion, extra volume of physicalizations going forward, to me at least.
Yeah, I feel like as there's so many places for this to go. As we get into new fabrication techniques, new materials, new understandings of old materials is another thing that keeps coming up, where we think we know ceramics, and then it turns out we know nothing about ceramics. You can 3D print ceramics, and you can print on ceramics. All of these crazy new techniques coming out. I feel like we've looked at the physical reality, but as you mentioned, as we get into more augmented and blended reality, and not just you are physical or virtual, but that handoff, and what are the strengths of each, what can we bring from each domain, I think is also really interesting emerging area of work. My little academic brain goes straight back to that conversation with Sam about what are the equivalents of Bertin's, visual variables in physical reality. That is like super interesting academic work that kind of needs to happen. But again, I feel like the bleeding edge are these practitioners who are just throwing themselves at interesting parts of this space and saying, hey, I wonder if I can get this to work. And they can. It takes time. It's not something that just happens easily or naturally. But for so many people, it's worth the effort of trying to figure out how to get this data to appear in this format, or how to bring this data to these people in a way that feels immediate, that feels relevant to where they're at.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe give it 10 years and then a sequel will absolutely be necessary. But just to close off and looking back at the existing book, not the sequel just yet, favorites. So Laura, what was your favorite case study in and of itself?
Oh, okay. So
who's your favorite child?
Exactly. So I'm partial to everything in handcraft because I was working with all of those authors much more in depth. So I'm very partial to, it's like my bias would be towards handcraft.
Right.
I think I think I am most sort of fascinated by 100% City by Rimini Protocol, because
Oh, okay.
it is so far from all of the forms of making that I am familiar with.
Yeah.
Um, and when I think about art, I tend to think about, I don't know, fine art and, you know, physicalization of sculpture, but not necessarily art as organizing people into a performance that rolls out over time and it's ephemeral. And it's like there's so many aspects of it that I find super fascinating, in part because it is so far out from
Right.
what I am capable of, which is
Yeah.
why I find it so interesting to unpack and think
Of
through
course.
all of the layers of how they even make it happen, and all of the execution that has to happen to bring those 100% City pieces into existence.
Excellent choice. Well, Samuel, you've had an extra 2 minutes to think about this. What would your selection be?
Well, this is really difficult. I have a bias toward participation because I was really focused on working with the participation author. But I think on a way, I really love Adrienne Segal's No Water Equivalent because of the beautifulness and the aesthetic of the piece at the end. But I have a really strong also attachment to Zoids because I think it's going forward into that direction of the blending between digital and physical world. So maybe in the future we're gonna have physical materials that could work with the same digital properties that we have in a computer. And I also love perceptual plastic because in a way I think one of the possibilities with visualization is also to focus on all these sustainability issues that's are due to the production process, but also where basically physicalization could also be a medium to show some of this issue. And I think like perceptual plastic is just amazing, like the scale, the size, the procedure. But it's really difficult because I think I like all of them.
Well, that's the thing, and the consequence of your selection is that they are sufficiently distinct where you can love them all. You're not trying to pick two of the same favorite bar charts, for example. They are so distinct, and yeah, I mean, just very quickly, my own favorite. I love the aesthetic beauty of the Snow Water Equivalent. That cabinet is just something that I want in my house. I love Perpetual Plastic as well, not least because I was a judge on that competition, so I had a little bit of familiar exposure. But I also love the photography of that piece. Not, again, it's the least important thing of that, but the way that they capture that process was brilliant. But I think if I had to pick one, it would be the Happy Endings, which is this project based on pipes, and it's almost like a collection of almost sort of figurative line charts to sort of show that things can end up being okay in the end. But I just love the process behind that, because it says find a pipe bender, and let's face it, there is one on every corner of every town. Find data, plot data, bend pipe. And I just love how it's just so brilliantly reduced. And it picks up on that point again that, these things, albeit there may be materials that we can't access easily, tools that we can't access easily, the fundamental thought process is quite simple and attainable, achievable for everyone. So yes, that's been a wonderful tour for this brilliant book. I can't recommend it enough. Congratulations to you two, but also to Till and to Wes as well in the process behind it. Thank you to everyone out there for listening and viewing, and see you again in the future for another episode of Explore Explain. See you soon. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.